Hello everybody, it's your old pal John back here for another interesting story. Something Interesting is the title of this program. And this one is going to be a little bit technical, a little bit, kind of geared towards maybe people that have a more mechanical interest in things. I'm talking specifically about trains. Why does nobody die in train wrecks anymore? At least not like they used to. It does happen in severe train wrecks. Every now and then we do have a passenger train or a metro train or something like that wrecks. But your chances of dying in a train wreck are really small. Really, really small. And the reason for that, even though their trains don't have seat belts or anything like that, the reason for that is a little invention called the Miller hook. And what the Miller hook was, it was a significant improvement in the way that train cars are coupled. And little improvements came along in trains to make them a tremendously safe form of transportation of goods and people. And before I get to what the Miller hook is, let's start with trains in their infancy. That's the 1850s. We had steam trains, locomotives that often would explode. When a boiler got to a point that it could not handle the pressure that it was under anymore, on a train, it would explode, sending shards of metal everywhere, a giant disaster, wiping out the train crew, and often other parts of the train too, sometimes carrying people. Back in the day, train cars were made out of wood. Since they were simply a form of transportation, wooden train cars may be around in museums nowadays, but you just don't do that anymore. One of the reasons is when trains were made out of wood, there were wood on a metal frame, and if there was some sort of an accident, the train stopped suddenly, or another train hit the back of another train, or it derailed for some reason, rather than spilling all over the tracks like they do now. You'll see a giant zigzag mess all over the place whenever trains wreck. Trains would do something really terrible called telescoping. The Miller hook fixed this problem, and I'll explain how in just a minute. But what happened in a telescoping train wreck is that you have a train car and another train car behind it. This one would stop suddenly or wreck or something like that. And rather than doing this, it did this. And that is the train car behind the one would telescope into the other car. And you can see how that would this train car is full of people. Squishes everybody. Terrible, terrible, terrible thing that would happen, usually killing everybody or injuring people very badly. This happened on up into the 1800s until the Miller hook was invented. And the Miller hook is a way of hooking together the trains so that whenever they wreck, rather than the train popping forward and telescoping into the other trains, they simply scissor all over the place. And so sometimes, like, Amtrak occasionally does have a wreck in America, and in Europe you have wrecks, but usually it's very rare that somebody is killed. Usually it's people being thrown around inside the car because the trains are wrecking and they're falling all over the place. But you don't have the huge loss of life that you would have in a telescoping car because they scissor. It makes a big mess. The train cars are all over the place. But thank goodness that thanks to the invention of the Miller hook, the trains no longer telescope. Now, as an interesting aside to this story, there was a train wreck, a terrible telescoping of a car, and only one person survived. He was injured, but he did survive the train wreck, and his name was Cornelius Vanderbilt, the first Vanderbilt to create the fortune. They called him the Commodore. And Commodore Vanderbilt was the only non-fatality in the car that he was traveling in whenever the second car behind it telescoped into it. This is interesting because Cornelius Vanderbilt made most of his money, some of it was in steamships, but most of his money came from the creation of the New York Central line, the New York Central train line. So he made his money from trains, even though they almost killed him. Cornelius Vanderbilt was an interesting fellow. In 1888, I think, when George Westinghouse came to Cornelius Vanderbilt with his new invention for trains, Vanderbilt said, "I don't have time for fools," and kicked him out. Well, George Westinghouse's invention was the air brake, which is almost universally used in its incarnation in the way that George Westinghouse invented it to this day. And then whenever Cornelius Vanderbilt finally realized that this is the way to go and this is the only way of the future for trains, Cornelius Vanderbilt contacted Mr. Westinghouse. And what did Mr. Westinghouse say? "I don't have time for fools." So anyway, be careful what you say, and also be glad that whenever you get on a train these days, or a metro train, you have a very, very good chance of making it to your destination in one piece, no matter what happens. That's something interesting.